Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. New semester. We're here today with UF Center for European Studies. They've been good enough to come about once a year and bring us some just wonderful programs about Europe. This year, our coordinator, Carla Ruffer, who will be talking to you in just a minute, we were talking about what the theme should be for the lectures this year. Last year, if you may recall, we had our theme was, now what happened to all of that? When we were looking at, for example, Brexit was in the news a couple of years ago. Now you don't hear much about it. How did that all turn out? And that was really fun. Now this year, we're focusing on some of the European capitals that are less traveled, not Paris, not London, not Berlin. So this was Carla's idea. So she knew what capitals she was looking at, but she had to find faculty who really knew those cities, not just somebody who'd studied them, but somebody who'd been there frequently or lived there. So we selected Warsaw, Vienna, and Prague. We'll have 2 lectures on each city, and we're starting this morning with Warsaw, and Natalia, Aleksiun, will be speaking, and I know you're going to really love this. She's a great speaker, but I'll let Carla introduce her. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Ron. Thank you all for having us back. We always love doing these series, and I appreciate you continued attendance. So thanks again for having us. Ron gave a great introduction of what we're going to do for this series, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Dr. Natalia Aleksiun is the Harry Rich Professor of Holocaust Studies at UF. She holds doctoral degrees from Warsaw University in Poland and NYU here in the US. She has written extensively on the history of Polish Jews, the Holocaust, Jewish intelligentsia in East Central Europe, Polish-Jewish relations, and modern Jewish historiography. She serves as co-editor of East European Jewish Affairs. Currently, she is completing a new book about Jews in hiding in Western Ukraine during the Holocaust. So, wonderful person to have, and we're very lucky to have her.
Good morning, everyone. Those who came here and those wonderful 14 people on Zoom. Good morning to you too. So it's a tough competition with Vienna and Prague, and I will try not to be too competitive, but I do want to talk to you about history of Warsaw through a very particular lens, that is the lens of Jewish history, and that's why you have 2 names, Warsaw or Warszawa in Polish, and Warsaw in Yiddish, as especially in the 19th and 20th century, a substantial number of inhabitants of Warsaw actually thought of it, lived in it, in Yiddish. And I tried to think of a sexy title, and the only one I came up with was the capital, the Jewish capital of Europe, possibly world Jewish capital, not anymore, of course, but in some ways, a lot of what we think of as crucial developments in Jewish politics, Jewish culture, religious Jewish life, a lot of them actually have their roots in Poland and more specifically in Warsaw. So this is just one of those typical nice images of contemporary Warsaw, with the Palace of Sciences and Culture, a gift from Joseph Stalin, built in the middle of the city from 1952 to 1955 when it was completed. And you might notice there is a lot of free space right in the middle. This is like the most prime land in the capital of Poland. This is because Warsaw basically was erased. This part of Warsaw, sort of on that side of the palace, would the ghetto start and then continue in this direction. But before the war, this was also very densely populated Jewish neighborhood, so-called northern neighborhood. And then whatever was not destroyed during the war, and especially during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, was destroyed during the uprising in August, September 1944. So that's why the landscape of Warsaw looks a little strange, like a combination of styles and strange free spaces. But this is the city that was and continues to be the capital of Poland from late 16th century. So in some ways, it's a latecomer to Polish history as well, but certainly a latecomer to Jewish history. And I would want to argue that it's really a window into everything that matters in European Jewish history and culture. So a jump from those this landscape with the skyscrapers and the palace, to the Feast of Trumpets, or really I think this is Tashlich, painted by Polish painter Aleksander Gierymski, who lived in Poland and in Italy, and was not particularly interested in Jewish topics, but he painted scenes from life he saw around. And because Jews were such a prominent part of everyday life of Warsaw, they appear in his paintings quite prominently. So this doesn't seem like a particularly metropolitan area, but this is the time when Warsaw is a somewhat provincial city in the Russian Empire, with a rapidly growing Jewish population. And I'll go back to it in a moment. I want to also bring to you this image from roughly the same period, 1897, the kind of image that I think a lot of us thinks about Eastern Europe, Jewish Eastern Europe, right? Traditional, poor, although this is a somewhat happy group picture of Jewish kids, and you see this narrow street, it's black and white, it adds to the atmosphere. But Warsaw Jewish history, it also is this fancy building, and I like playing games with my students and showing them some upper middle class images from Jewish Warsaw and asking them where they think these pictures were taken, and they go exactly for Paris or Berlin or even New York, although this is a terrible answer given the architecture. But they don't associate Eastern Europe or Warsaw with what we would call today Reform synagogue. This is the Great Tłomackie Synagogue, and note here the entrance because of the next image I will show you. And as you can see, it was inaugurated yesterday, however many years ago, I can't do math, on Rosh Hashanah on the Jewish New Year in 1878. So we have already, at the time when Gierymski is painting these traditional Hasidic Jews, we also have enough people wearing different clothes and interested in different kind of services, and also, let's be realistic, having enough money to pay for this building to be designed and built, with a fancy choir, with the best cantors. And it is said that on Yom Kippur, Christian Varsalians would come to the synagogue to hear Kol Nidre sang by the best operetta voices in Europe. So I want you to keep in mind these two images. And of course, this is the third image that is important for thinking about Jewish Warsaw, which is the same building blown up on the orders of Jürgen Strupp at the very end of Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, as a symbol of the end of Jewish life in Warsaw. Well, there's a question mark to this end, but I'll leave it for the end of our conversation. So there will be no test on dates, so don't worry. Just to give you a sense that when Warsaw is still a medieval town in the Duchy of Mazovia, not part of the Polish crown yet, Jews already live there. There is a so-called Jewish street, there is a synagogue, there is a cemetery, but the community goes, as in many major cities in Europe, especially Western Central Europe, they go through the series of expulsions. They come back, they're expelled, they come back, they're expelled, they come back. And the fact that they, this special privilege of not tolerating the Jews, in Latin, that is given already by the Polish king in 1527, is repeatedly reissued. What it means is that Jews are coming back, and the city needs to remind them, no, we have this privilege, you are not allowed to live here. But there is also a legal trick that allows for the Jewish population to actually be present, even though technically they're not allowed to live there. From 16th century on, which is those judicial enclaves, mainly nobility, but also church, areas that they simply own, and they are taken out of the legal rules of the municipality. So Jews cannot live in Warsaw except for my 3 streets. And they can leave my 3 streets and go and do business, pay the ticket to enter the city. The city gets money from it. So there is really a continued Jewish presence in Warsaw that in the meantime becomes the capital of Kingdom of Poland. But the community as such, the Kehila, is not recognized because officially they're not there. So it's this strange illegal presence, not very unusual, the same way that Jews in Paris before the French Revolution live in Paris, even though they're not supposed to be there. So just to give you a sense, I don't know if this clicker does the wonders of pointing at things, but if you go down to Russia, notice the nothing, 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 0, 0, right? And then the rather large growing numbers under Poland, which is to say, Warsaw is part of Polish Jewish story. There are no Jews in Russia until partitions of Poland, and they will basically be Polish Jews that become part of the Russian Empire. Again, this is just for context of the bigger story that the Jews, as elsewhere in Europe, tend to be urban population, especially in smaller towns, smaller private towns where they receive privileges to settle down and they get tax breaks and the communities can set up all kinds of institutions that are crucial to the functioning of a Jewish community, such as cemetery, mikvah, synagogue, etc., etc. But Warsaw, again, is not one of those small towns, and if I was cruel, I would ask you to pronounce those names, but it doesn't have the community, doesn't have officially these institutions, and yet has the presence. And here's my little, my husband told me there are much better pictures, resolution pictures of this, but trust me, this is one of the famous images of a Venetian painter, Canaletto, who, funny fact, was not just a favorite painter of the last king of Poland, Stanisław August Poniatowski. He also painted a lot of Venice, but he painted a lot of Warsaw, and after Warsaw was destroyed in World War II, the old town, the fake old town, was rebuilt using his paintings as a documentation, because he was that precise. So certainly something that he didn't have in mind, painting those images. But what I'm interested in here are those two guys chatting up next to the column devoted to the King Sigismund, who moved officially the capital from Krakow to Warsaw. These are Jews. Again, not a good resolution, but these are two men in traditional Jewish hats and long garbs, which means to say, yes, Jews are not officially living here, but they're part of the landscape. Canaletto cannot skip them. They're there. They just mingle in between people, doing business, coming and going. This is the absolute center of Warsaw. In this direction, just behind us, or pretty much where you're sitting, is the royal castle. So they're not hidden in shadow. And here are those jurydyki, those privately owned territories, just to give you a sense that it's pretty much the city itself, right? This map is shocking. It's like you would think that those privately owned streets here and street there are just a minority of Warsaw, but they are completely dominating this image. And probably won't tell you much, but Nowolipki and Leszno are some of the most crucial Jewish streets in 19th and 20th century. There are songs written about them. There is poetry written about them, and they are already part of this map of semi-legal Jewish presence, including Tłomackie, as in the Great Synagogue. This is where the Great Synagogue will be erected, and so Jews live in those areas along other not beloved by Christian burghers. Inhabitants, Protestants, for example, are not welcome, but they can live in those special private territories. The situation of Jewish Warsaw changes dramatically at the end of 18th century with the partitions of Poland. But if you can read the colors, and to make it particularly complicated, I use the Polish map. But this is Warsaw, and Warsaw in the partitions of Poland, which erased Poland from the map of Europe for 150 years, becomes first part of Prussia. This is not part of Russia. It only will be a part of Russia after Napoleonic Wars. What it means is that Warsaw Jews are included in a lot of reforms, legal reforms that are going on in Prussia, which tend to take down medieval legal restrictions on Jewish population. So for the first time, the Jewish community as such is recognized. They receive official permission to open a lot of institutions that would not be allowed before, and that includes Jewish cemetery. And if you do go to Warsaw, this is the one amazing place to visit, the Okopowa Cemetery. Ironically, it's the best place to learn about Jewish life in Warsaw in the past today. And just to give you an example, one very fancy burial of a very wealthy Jewish banker who belonged to the family that basically controlled banking, finance of Warsaw and of Kingdom of Poland for decades, but also gave us Henri Bergson, French philosopher, 4 generations, his great-great-grandson down. And here is a beautiful image of Jerusalem, which looks a lot more like Warsaw, the banks of Vistula. Again, to the story of Jewish presence, my favorite painter, Gierymski, his very, very famous image of a Jewish woman selling oranges. There is a version also of this painting where she's selling lemons. And we are having also increasingly a number of photographs. And again, you see this is a market day. It's not a Jewish market day, but Jewish presence. It's extremely visible and recognizable here. And Jews are playing a hugely important role in the economic life of Warsaw, from small stalls and shops to big enterprises. And again, I always play with my student a game, can you find a Jew in this image, which is not a Jewish themed painting, but if you look up in the left corner, there is a Jewish, traditional Orthodox Jewish man that is walking on Vistula banks along the policeman, the fancy couple with tall hat, etc., etc. This is just Warsaw as it is in late 19th century. Now, the traditional Jews are extremely visible and will remain extremely visible and important for Jewish Warsaw because Warsaw becomes one of the important Hasidic centers. And the Bergson family that I showed you the fancy burial site of is one of the many reasons they are supporting Hasidic community. They give money for Hasidic prayer houses, for Hasidic butchers, for the whole Hasidic infrastructure. And the most important of those will be Gerer Hasidim, second largest Hasidic community in the world before the Holocaust. Ger comes from Góra Kalwaria, a small town on the outskirts of Warsaw. This was the sort of the site of the leader who lived there, but his followers were primarily in Warsaw itself. So in that way, we see again how Warsaw is a window into this Hasidic march, triumphant march throughout Eastern Europe, but also new trends. And here you have very famous painting of a burial of 5 Polish demonstrators that died, shot by the Russian police as they were demonstrating basically against Russian occupation. And one of those who were killed was Michał Landy, a young teenager student in a artisan school who famously held the cross when a monk was wounded and was falling, and the cross would fall on the ground, and this Jewish boy grabbed the cross and held it, and then was struck and killed as well. And you see this moment of so-called Polish-Jewish brotherhood. There is a rabbi, there is a priest. The rabbi is here, you see in a fur hat. There are there's a Protestant clergy. The whole nation, not a Catholic nation, but nation of all those who consider themselves bound to Polish history, culture, identity, bound together in their struggle. It's painted also not accidentally by a Jewish painter. It's a certain dream that in Warsaw never quite fully realized, but that's an element of the changes. While Hasidic Jews become such superpower in Warsaw, there is also a growing number of acculturated, assimilated Jews who see themselves more as Poles of Mosaic faith, as they call themselves. And one expression was creating this rabbinical seminary, which famously did not produce a single pulpit rabbi. Older graduates became important journalists, lawyers, writers, educators, everything else, not actually a rabbi. So in some ways, a total failure. And you will also see this is the resting place of the last director of this seminary, which does not look like a traditional Jewish grave at all, right? It's just a writing in Polish about blessed memory of Jakub Tugendhat, although the date, at least the date, is in the Jewish calendar, but not a lot more. Another example of changes is this first newspaper published in Eastern Europe. Don't try to read it, or maybe try. One side is in Polish, one side is in Judeo-German. It's Hebrew characters. It's not really Yiddish. There's a lot of silent H, but it's the first attempt to publish news for the Jews of Warsaw in sort of Yiddish, which most of them read, and in Polish. Warsaw is also a window into what's going on because it's not free from increasing occurrences of mass anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish violence. One most infamous is this pogrom in Warsaw in 1881. And you might remember that in 1881-82, there's a wave of pogroms in Russia in general, which brings a lot of Jews ultimately to the United States. So Warsaw is not immune from it. If you bring me again, I can talk about anti-Semitic violence as a topic itself, but just to mark that there is a huge gap between this dream about Polish-Jewish brotherhood and the actual reality of daily life. And again, another image of just a marketplace. This is actually Old City, and if you look closer, you will see a lot of men that we can assume are Jewish. With women, it's a lot more difficult because they're not dressed in any particular way. So they are probably among the crowd as well. And just to put Warsaw and its population in perspective, see the numbers of East European cities in the 19th century, and dramatic rise of all of them, Łódź or Lodz probably most, because Lodz starts as a village and becomes a huge industrial center. But in Warsaw, on the eve of World War I, over 1/3 of the population is Jewish. It's a substantial number of people. So we will have all kinds of institutions with all kinds of political flavors that a community of over 300,000 would be establishing to serve the needs of the poor, to serve the needs of intelligentsia, of industrialists, of artisans, of religious Jews of all kinds. Again, I could talk just about these institutions, but I love this picture with a Yiddish inscription on top. And this comes from World War I, when Warsaw came under German occupation, which lasted from 1915 to 1918, when Poland is reborn after 150 years. And Warsaw now officially becomes the capital again of the Second Polish Republic. This is important also because this is the capital of the largest Jewish community in Europe, and Warsaw itself approaches again 400,000 Jews on the eve of the war. Probably no time for minority treaty, but just to give you a sense, Warsaw and Polish Jews in general, they on the one hand start this period which will become the interwar period, but they of course don't know that the Great War will be followed by another war and the Holocaust, with legally promised protection from minority treaties signed as part of agreements in Paris on the one hand, and the minority treaty becomes part of the Constitution, but it's one of those great things in the books that in reality is not exactly followed. And very early on, in 1922, the first president of Poland, Gabriel Narutowicz, is shot and killed by a right-wing extremist following a huge campaign of hate that basically argued that he was chosen with the votes of Jewish representatives in the Polish parliament. And so even though he was an ethnic Pole, he was not legitimate because Jews, while having full rights as citizens, really should not be deciding about Poland's future. Notice there is a cross on his hands, but this was not enough, and it's rather terrifying, but the grave of the man who killed Narutowicz is still visited. There are flowers put on his grave. He's remembered by some as a hero. And these are the first Jewish representatives to the Polish parliament. Without going into too many details, you have here the whole variety, right? From very traditional rabbis to very secular politicians, from Orthodox parties through Zionist parties, through Folkist, that is Jewish nationalist parties, and the whole array of political visions. But Jews will remain throughout the 1920s and 1930s in this precarious situation in Warsaw and in Poland of depending on the goodwill of those in power. And I love this picture because it shows this situation of dependency. This is Józef Piłsudski, the founding father of Poland's independence, whose death in 1935 was mourned by many Jews who feared, and rightly feared, that after his death, they will no longer be protected. And indeed, what follows in the late 30s is a wave of a lot more violence and open anti-Semitism. Warsaw Jews are very much affected by Great Depression, and while there are well-to-do people and upper middle class, most of Warsaw Jews is poor, and they will just start to emerge from that depression, Great Depression, in mid-30s, not long before the war begins. Just to give you some taste, though, of the experimentation that is going on during this period, this is the Institute of Judaic Studies, which is now the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, which was trying to train modern rabbis, social workers, and teachers. My favorite part of the story is that the rabbis were, those studying to become rabbis were men, those studying to become teachers were women, and there were a lot of marriages between the class of rabbis and the class of teachers who would meet in the same building. But the community was certainly with a vision that they are going to grow, they need new modern stuff, they need new bold ideas, new schools, their own historians. This is a University of Warsaw image of Emanuel Ringelblum, the future founder of the underground archive, Onek Shabbat archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. But here he's just beginning to study history in my first alma mater. A lot of interesting work, art being done here, just a choice, impossible choice, but Nathan Rappaport, you might be familiar with the monument to the heroes of Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. This will be his sculpture erected in 1948 after the war, but he's studying art at Warsaw Academy of Fine Arts. A huge number of Jewish physicians, Jews are at most 10%, then 9% of the population of Poland. They are 40% of physicians, and in Warsaw there are 70% of physicians. And that same thing goes for lawyers. So free professions are, as the anti-Semitic discourse would have it, dominated by Jews, or Jews were overrepresented. But I'm very interested in the kinds of medical professions that the Jews were particularly visible in Warsaw in particular, and one of those is neurology. I'm yet to understand why, but basically the entire leading cohort of men and women who created Polish neurology, including professional journals, were Jewish. Goldflam was known not only for his research and several conditions that are named after him, but also for receiving scores of patients, poor patients with no payment, and his funeral was attended by many, many grateful Jewish and not Jewish former patients. It's also, Warsaw is also a site of vigorous theatrical activities. This is the gravestone of Esther Rachel Kamińska. If you read Yiddish, it says Mame, the mother of Yiddish theater. Here, Ludwig Zamenhof's grave at the Warsaw Cemetery, the father, if we're in the language of mothers and fathers, of Esperanto, the artificial international language, which was to end all wars, because people will be able to talk to one another, and they will understand one another, and there will be no hatred anymore. Beautiful dream of another Jewish physician. He was an ophthalmologist by training. Anti-Semitism is there, and it's certainly on a rise, especially in the 30s, and there is an ongoing discussion among historians to what extent this is the influence coming from the Third Reich, to what extent it's completely indigenous, and that anti-Semites were basically looking to Germany for inspiration rather than needing the idea itself. But just to give you an impression, this is just one caricature that presents a Jew, as you can see, and other Jews, and there is a whole scholarly literature on how Jewish men are emasculated and presented in anti-Semitic discourse as those whining, weak individuals, and they're all here just like that. And this Jew is complaining that there will be another pogrom. And what is this pogrom, asks the person on the right. Well, there will be an investigation into our businesses, right? So the implication is all those Jewish complaints about anti-Jewish violence are fake, and that Jews are dishonest in their businesses. So you basically fry two fish in one anti-Semitic image. During the war, Warsaw comes under German occupation very early, already in late September 1939. This engineer trained in Dresden, therefore fully fluent in German, who has worked in a Jewish community. He was particularly interested in vocational training of Jewish teenagers, of Jewish youth, is appointed as the head of the Judenrat, the Jewish Council, and made personally responsible for carrying out German orders. I don't even want to see how much time I have left. So I will not go into too many details, but just to give you one aspect of the life in Warsaw Ghetto. This is still before, shortly before, but April, right, 1940, Jews are already wearing here armbands. There are all kinds of restrictions on their daily life, but they are not yet put into the ghetto, and the life of mutual help. ZSS stands for Jewish Mutual Help Association, is distributing matzah before the holiday. And the Warsaw Ghetto will be the largest ghetto in all of Nazi-occupied Europe. It will be 450,000, although we will never know exactly. It certainly approaches 500,000 people. Those that originally lived in Warsaw, those that seek to escape there because they think they will be safer among many more Jews, those that are forcibly deported there by the Nazis from smaller towns in the area. And the ghetto is sealed. All this is always happening on Jewish holidays. The Nazis love to pass terrible decrees against Jews on holy Jewish days. And you see here the map. The blue thing is the Vistula, and the ghetto corresponds to a large degree with the most densely populated by Jews area of Warsaw. So many people don't need to move, but there are still those that do. And within a few weeks and months, there is terrible suffering of overcrowded apartments, of not enough food, not enough fuel. People are cut off from their businesses that were Aryanized already before. They are not allowed to withdraw money from their bank accounts. Many professions lose any way of being performed, such as, for example, lawyers, right? What do you do? So many lawyers will actually join the Jewish police as one way of supporting themselves and their families. I stopped myself from putting on the PowerPoint the images of starving, dying children on the streets of Warsaw, but this is the image. If you think of many of the pictures, they often have crowds. And this is not just, a particular moment in a day. So many people are crowded. There are always crowds in the streets. And when you read diaries, people talk about how they dreamt of having a chance to be on their own. Just renting a room, not to be with dozens of people and not to be always surrounded by people. But life goes on, and this is one of those crazy images, maternity ward in a ghetto, right? It's very painful to think of what awaited these women and the babies that were born, but you can see there's still white linens, nurses dressed in meticulously cleaned aprons. There is really a huge effort, and even those plants by the bedside, huge effort to keep life as close to normal as possible and to support those that cannot support themselves. And of course, there isn't enough resources to be able to do it. And a lot of people engaged in those help initiatives begin to talk about the frustration that this is all for nothing. They just prolong the suffering because that one soup that they can distribute will not keep people alive. It's just a prolonged starvation. But again, huge effort, especially directed towards children. In individual houses, people organized to care together for children, and institutions that existed before the war try to ramp up their activities on behalf of the children, orphans, half orphans, and children whose parents simply cannot provide for them. Again, images And you see here all kinds of activities that are taking place in a ghetto, all kinds of activities that are also fundraising activities, right? Come to a tea and lecture and pay a few zloty for the kitchen for the orphans. In the summer of 1942, after 2 years of starvation and disease, and according to all statistics, Warsaw Ghetto would have died out because of conditions, but it was not fast enough for the final solution. We have those terrible weeks of deportations to Treblinka death camp, during which almost 300,000 Jews are put on cattle trains. Here they're awaiting the train to arrive and gassed, almost all of them gassed upon arrival. Those who remain until the spring of 1943 live more in a concentration camp than a ghetto. There is very strict hours when you can be outside, where you can be inside. People are marched in groups to forced labor, followed by Warsaw Ghetto uprising in April 1943, when young people that organized into underground following the Great Deportations in the summer of 42 believed that the Germans are not now liquidating whoever remained. So they tried to fight back. And we see here burning ghetto and people that are captured in houses, house by house is emptied and marched to the trains. Again, just to say, this is very difficult for me to find a way of talking about it, because what we have especially are the images that are, the pictures that are taken by perpetrators. And I always wonder about the ethics of showing people in their last moments captured and shot on the ground, and making this into a large image that we look at. But these are the images that we have. So, but we do need to remember that this is not a picture taken by the victims. And for me, this is a symbol of emptied Jewish Warsaw, the Nożyk Shul, empty, burned out in 1944. It actually remained only because the Germans used it as a stable. Other synagogues were destroyed completely. But with the permission of my husband, I actually want to end on that note. This is our wedding 16 years ago in Nożyk Shul, with a lot of friends joining us. And this is when I was supposed to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalia. Wonderful presentation and a difficult subject, to be sure. Are there any questions or comments? It's okay, but just ready to go. Let's see. Oh, it's on. Oh, I think. There you go.
Natalia, at the beginning of the 20th century, reflected huge Jewish populations in these Eastern European cities. Was this a result of in-migration, and if so, where were the immigrants coming from?
This huge rise. This is a great question. Actually, this is really a great question. So two things. One is, in fact, immigration. So-called Litvaks. They were not exactly Lithuanian Jews, but they were Jews coming. Are you from a Litvak family? Hello. So this was the code name for Jews coming west from what was basically Pale of Settlement, the former eastern territories of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They were not part of Kingdom of Poland. There was a tax border. And Kingdom of Poland had a semi-autonomous status. But in order to punish the Poles for yet another anti-Russian uprising in 1863, oh my God, they would take away my Polish diploma for making this mistake. That border was erased, and now Kingdom of Poland was made part of the Russian Empire. And it presented a lot of economic opportunities for Jews from small towns in the Pale of Settlement. So they were coming to cities like Warsaw, like Łódź, Lodz, like other cities in Congress Poland or Kingdom of Poland, former Kingdom of Poland, but also more to the west, right, to Berlin, and further. But they contribute to this hike. And then there is a big demographic question. It seems that Jewish population in the late 19th century has roughly the same number of children as the Christian population, but less Jewish babies die. So all population is growing throughout Eastern Europe, but the the Jewish population is growing sort of out of proportion. And the conversation among historians and demographers is, how do we explain this difference? So some of the ideas that were put forward was that Jewish families tend to be more stable, there's less divorces, less abandoned wives. There is this system of so-called caste, in which a young boy after marriage moves in with his in-laws who are supporting him, but as a result, the first baby, maybe even the second baby, is born in the house of the young mother, with her mother taking care of her, and that might contribute to greater chances that the conditions are as optimal as possible. And then Jews tend to be urban anyway. So those two, the Litvaks, your family, and this demographic difference seem to be adding to these numbers just growing rapidly. Again, the big cities are growing rapidly anyway, but when you look closer, the Jewish population is really multiplying.
Other questions, Rick?
Thanks so much. During the 20th century, it looks to me like there was a very significant ability of Jewish community to organize civil society organizations politically, socially, culturally. Could you sort of go into that?
Another wonderful question. So the idea is generally that Jews have this tradition of communal autonomy, right? In the Middle Ages, not only in Poland, in fact, this starts in Ashkenaz, in Germany, in German lands. They would have charters given by the owner of the town or the ruler, it could be a prince or a bishop, to kind of run their own affairs. All they needed to do is to pay taxes, but not per capita. The community as entity would agree, would be given a certain number and pay. So in order to collect that money, Jews needed to organize themselves, right? Who pays how much, who collects, who decides, and then there were all the religious matters that needed to be provided, and they needed to be organized. So there had to be a Jewish butcher, there had to be some kind of a establishment for poor Jews, because the Christians would not be taking care of these people, and especially those in trouble would potentially be easy prey to convert. So it was in community self-interest to create a network of institutions, not to mention that there were ethical rules, right? In Pirkei Avot, certain certain prescriptions to take care of the poor, to take care of widows, to provide for brides with no money. So community would create already in the Middle Ages all these institutions and organizations, and then they went through upgrade into modernity. But the model was certainly there. So again, not just in Warsaw, but throughout Europe, you would see, Vienna, you will have a separate conversation about Vienna, but one of the largest teaching hospitals in Europe was the Allgemeine Krankenhaus, the General Hospital of Vienna. But there was a huge Jewish hospital run by the community. And you could say, why did the community need that hospital? There was a city hospital to go to, but there was a tradition of a separate institution, of separate orphanage, separate schools, because you wanted to teach your kids in a particular way. Now, there were 5 Jews and 17 ideas in what way these children should be taught, right? In Yiddish, in Polish, in German, in Russian, in Hebrew, with holidays, without holidays, proletarian spirit, or Orthodox spirit. But still, this meant a particular Jewish project. So I think this is how, between tradition and need, the community, broadly defined community, organizes itself.
Would you explain what is the Pale of Settlement and how it came about?
Thank you. Pale of Settlement basically existed and became codified. So when Poland is partitioned between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, every Polish child needs to know these dates, woken up in the middle of the night, 1772, 1792, and 1795. But when eastern parts of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth are partitioned by Russia, this is how Jews become part of the Russian Empire. There are no Jews before, not any significant number. And so Catherine the Great, in all her greatness, figures out that for now, she will keep things as they are. So Jews are allowed to stay where they live, but they are not allowed to start moving to Moscow, to Russia proper. So they will become sort of limited in their settlement opportunities and possibilities to places where they already live. And that eastern part of former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth becomes Pale of Settlement. The aspiration of those Jews who pursued, either business, big imperial level business, or that were seeking secular education, people aspired to get out of the Pale of Settlement and go elsewhere. And there increasingly in the 19th century, there would be categories of Jews who could settle somewhere else. So these included, you can guess, if you had a lot of money, like really top-notch merchants and financial elite. If you won Golden Award in your gymnasium, basically if you were a genius, then you could be this one Jew allowed to study at the Moscow University and settle, or if you survived 25 years of service in the Russian army, you could settle. So few people managed to get this privilege to live beyond the Pale of Settlement. And then when Poland is punished by removing the border, semi-autonomous border, this is when so-called Litvaks move west. This is for them an opportunity to expand into new places.
And could you explain how many Poles are required to take German names?
Oh, yeah, this is, again, a great question. So and I can actually connect it to Warsaw. So when Poland is partitioned, there are some Jews that have traditional Jewish names, right? Cohen, Levi, but most Jews are, Shmuel, the son of Yitzchak. You don't need last name, you need just your Hebrew name for religious purposes. But at least two of the partitioning powers, Austria and Prussia, are in the midst of modernizing revolution. They want to reconstruct these empires into enlightened, new enlightened states. What does it mean? The state wants to know where each and every inhabitant, not yet citizen, where each and every inhabitant lives. Why? Not because they love them, but because they want their sons for the army and their money for taxes. And how do you trace people to get the sons and to get the money? When you know where they live, and for this you need a list. And for this, Shmuel, son of Isaac, another Shmuel, son of Isaac, and another Shmuel, son of Isaac, doesn't help. So Jews are obligated to take on names. And because those two countries that are moving fastest with the modernizing process are Prussia and Austria, this is how millions of Jews bear those German-sounding names. By the way, there were rates for names. So if you wanted a nice name with Blumen, with flowers in it, you needed to pay. And there were some nasty guys who would give you really a bad-sounding name, a piece of fat hanging on a tree or something. So names are also interesting, what people get. In the Russian part of partition, there is a less centralized process, and the names will tend to follow the Slavic combination. Someone from Warsaw, Warszawski, someone from Krakow, Krakowski, etc., or the son of Esther, or the son of Fruma, Frumkin, the son of Hannah, Hankin, etc., But the German names are characteristic for the Prussian and Austrian partition, and Warsaw, as I mentioned, comes first under Prussian partition. So Warsaw Jews would be renamed with those German-sounding names.
Any other questions? This has just been marvelous. Thank you so much. Next week, we have a different take on Warsaw, looking more at modern Warsaw. Our speaker will be talking about how do you get from the train station to the hotel? What are the restaurants like? It'll be a different view. And by the way, that picture that you showed, almost the first one of modern Warsaw, that was unbelievable. So we'll get a different look at Warsaw next week, but thank you, Natalia. This has just been wonderful. See you next week, folks.